evening, everybody. As I announced last week, I had to make a quick trip to the United States, and I literally came back around 2 hours ago. So I am a little exhausted, so if I fall asleep on you, or if I'm not quite coherent, please accept my apologies. But hopefully there'll be something useful that will be said tonight in either case. We know that the Haftorah this week is, of course, not the Haftorah connected to the Parsha of the week, but it is the second of the 4 special Shabbatot before Pesach. The first was the reading of the half shekel, Machzis shekel, and which we talked about, and the second is the reading about the eradication of Amalek. And the reason why we have both a Torah reading about Amalek in the Maftir and the Haftorah about Shaul and Amalek is simply because, according to rabbinic tradition, Haman is descended from Amalek, although the Megillah does not say it explicitly. And therefore, when we, the Shabbat before Purim, we commemorate the eradication of Amalek, because Haman's death is also an eradication of Amalek. Now, to go to the basic story, just a few basic points to keep in mind. Shaul was anointed as the first king of Israel. Until Shaul, there were various leaders that went by the name Shoftim, and there's a whole book in Tanakh called the Book of Shoftim. But the Jewish people come to the great Navi Shmuel, and they say they want a king. And you'll recall that Shmuel is very negative about that request. Shmuel says, "Oh, you want a king? Isn't God enough? Isn't God's laws enough for you? Why do you want a king to be like all the Goyim, like all the nations?" And then he talked about how the king will enslave you and take your sons and your daughters and levy taxes. And at the end, they still said, "We want a king." And Shmuel even said, and this is during the month of Nisan, "Let there be a hailstorm," that God should show that he doesn't like your decision. But nevertheless, a king was chosen. And that first king that was chosen was Shaul HaMelech. Now, Shaul only ruled for 2 years. And Shaul is a very, very complicated person. On one hand, he is described as a very, very great tzaddik. On the other hand, we see that he was prone to severe depression and sometimes violence against David. But I just want to ask 2 questions. Again, these are basic questions that all the Meforshim talk about. And that is, number one, there seems to be a mitzvah in the Torah itself for the Jewish people to appoint a king. This is in Parshat Shoftim. Som Tosim Alecha Melech. The Rambam, for example, says this is one of the 613 mitzvot that the Jewish people are supposed to have a melech. Why we don't have that today, this is an interesting question. Maybe it depends on a Beis HaMikdash, but l'chol hapachos, there is a mitzvah to have a melech. So if that's the case, number one, why is Shmuel upset at their request? But number 2, why did they wait hundreds of years before they made the request? They didn't just enter Eretz Yisrael. They've been in Eretz Yisrael more than 400 years at this point. Right? So one is a kasha on why is Shmuel angry, and the other is a kasha, why did people delay? A third question is that when Yaakov was blessing his children before his death, Yaakov Avinu said, "Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda." The scepter of royal authority belongs to the tribe of Yehuda. This was Yaakov Avinu's designation. David, of course, comes from Shevet Yehuda, but Shaul HaMelech comes from Malchus Binyamin. So why was the first king not of the tribe of Yehuda, but of the tribe of Binyamin? Right, so these are 3 basic questions. Why did they delay in getting a king? Why is Shmuel upset at their request? And number 3, why is the first king from the tribe of Binyamin and not from the tribe of Yehuda? The first question is actually the most difficult, why they delayed. There is some thought that perhaps you don't have a king until you have a Beis HaMikdash, but the truth of the matter is, even in Shmuel's time, they did not yet have a Beis HaMikdash. There is another thought that you don't appoint a king until the nation is at peace, and they did not attain a kind of peace until that time. On the other hand, Some have said that the argument goes the other way, that it's the role of the king to create the peace. So I'm going to leave that question off for a side. Maybe we'll come to it later. But in terms of why is Shmuel angry, so here the Drasha Saran says that Shmuel is not angry at the fact that they requested a king. That is legitimate in the Torah. But the fact that they wanted a king and they said, Kechol HaGoyim, we want to imitate the nations of the world. We want to have a king that will give us, our own laws, our own legislation, our own moral standards, which are maybe different than those of the Torah. We want to be a nation like all other nations. So it was not a sin to request a king. It was a sin to request a king for those particular reasons. Because that showed a lack of emunah, a lack of faith in God, a lack of obedience to the Torah, and too much of a desire to imitate the culture and the mores of other nations. Now, because of that, the Rambam says this answers the third question. Since their request was improper, since their motivations were not good, since they were not trying to fulfill the mitzvah of the Torah, but to simply be like all of the nations of the world, definitionally, they don't get a malchut that will last. The malchut of Yehuda is intended to last. They were given a malchut that by definition was intended to be transient and temporary. Which means the reason why the first king was from Binyamin, and not, or at least not from Yehuda, was because it was intended to be temporary at the very outset. Since, the Rambam writes, they were shoel shaloka hogen, since they asked for improper motives, they were given a malchut sha'ah, they were given a temporary, ephemeral malchut. Now this is what the Rambam says. I just want to point out that again, this is a little tricky, because it is mashma from the narrative of Amalek that Shaul lost his malchut only because he failed to carry out the commandment of God. Had Shaul properly carried out the commandment of God, the malchut would have endured. Now, that's a problem, because how could it possibly endure? What would happen to the fact that Malchus belongs to Yehuda? And the Rambam's statement that Shaul was a Malchus that initially was intended to be temporary seems to be contradicted by the narrative itself. So because of this, some understand Malchut Shaul in a different way. Meaning the Rambam's understanding is, since the motives of those who requested the Melech were not proper motives, God gave them a temporary, transient Malchus. That's the Rambam's opinion. Others see Malchut Shaul in a more positive way. And the more positive way they look at it, I'm going to use a historical analogy that obviously the Meforshim don't use. And that is, during the American Civil War, so Lincoln's vice president for his second term was Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln got assassinated. And as you know, Andrew Johnson was on verge of being removed from office through impeachment and the like. And part of why Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson was because Andrew Johnson had been senator from Tennessee, and at least part of Tennessee had rebelled against the United States by joining the Confederacy. So Lincoln wanted to make a point that even these states that had left, if they now do tshuva and they come back, they will be part of the United States. And therefore he specifically wanted to elevate somebody from a former part of the Confederacy to a high political office to bring him back. Seen in this way, I want to suggest that there is an analogy to why the first king of Israel was a Benjaminite. Because shortly before Shmuel, at the end of the book of Judges, at the end of the book of Shoftim, there's an awful, awful story about the tribe of Benjamin in which a man's concubine had been gang raped and left to die. And the man was so incensed at this injustice, although he was no great tzaddik himself, that he cut up her dead body into 12 pieces, and he sent a piece to each tribe demanding justice against Binyamin. And there was a civil war against the tribe of Binyamin, in which all of the tribes were going against Binyamin. And obviously Binyamin was greatly outnumbered. And not only that, but at the conclusion of the war, which left very few Binyaminites even alive, the people took a solemn oath that no man will allow his daughter to marry a man from Binyamin, which would have meant eventually the extinction of the tribe. Eventually that vow was annulled, and in fact it was annulled on the 15th of Av, which is one of the reasons why the 15th of Av became a festive day. The Ramban writes, by the way, that the machlokas, the reason why Binyamin did not want to extradite the wrongdoer, is because Binyamin took the position, very interesting political position, that every tribe, although we were united by a common religion, every tribe was a sovereign country. And therefore, every tribe had the right to judge all crimes that were committed in their tribe. And there was no concept that other tribes could demand extradition or whatever it would be. And the principle that was established was that Am Yisrael is one nation, and every shevet can get involved if justice is not being carried out. So it turns out that Binyamin at this stage was decimated, lowly, despised, rejected. So what does Hashem want? Hashem wants the very first Malchut to be the Malchut of Binyamin, to establish that Binyamin is now part and parcel of Klal Yisrael, meaning the same way Lincoln uses Andrew Johnson to reestablish the ability of the Confederacy to come back into the United States. So Lahavdil HaKadosh Baruch Hu invites Binyamin to become the Melech, even though this is in the aftermath of Pilagesh Begiva. There is a third perspective of why there had to be a Malchus Shaul, and that third perspective is a Gemara in Bava Basra. The Gemara in Bava Basra says, Amalek can only be defeated by the children of Rachel. They cannot be defeated by the children of Leah. Binyamin, of course, is a child of Rachel. I'll show you the pattern. And before there can be the Davidic line, Amalek has to be eradicated. But Amalek can only be eradicated by the children of Rachel, not the children of Leah. So the very purpose of the Malchus of Shaul was to engineer the eradication of Amalek. That is why it is so crucial that when he fails to do that, his Malchus is terminated, because that was literally the very reason why there's a Malchus to begin with. Now, this is a Gemara that says Amalek can only be defeated by Zera Rachel and not Zera Leah.
Is this like maybe a part of the source where there's Mashiach ben Yosef?
Yes. So let me just show you how this goes through. The very first time Amalek attacked us in the desert, the general that Moshe Rabbeinu puts in charge of fighting against Amalek is his successor, Yehoshua ben Nun, who in those days was called Hoshea, but the Torah refers to him as Yehoshua ben Nun. And Yehoshua ben Nun is from the tribe of Ephraim, which is from Yosef, which is from Rachel. The first king of Israel, who was given the mission to eradicate Amalek, which David HaMelech is not later, is Shaul from the tribe of Binyamin. Now, why is it sometimes Binyamin and sometimes Yosef? That we don't know, but the common denominator is it's always from the children of Rachel. Mordechai and Esther. Now remember what happened. Shaul spared the king of Amalek, who was Agag. And although Agag was killed by Shmuel, but in the brief time that Agag was free, Chazal understand that he impregnated a woman, who was not apprehended, and that woman was the child was the ancestor of Haman. So Mordechai and Esther, who are descended from Shaul, are the ones who engineer the downfall and death of Haman, because they are misaking what Shaul failed to do. Shaul failed to kill Agag. Mordechai and Esther have to be the one that kills Agag's descendants. Again, Binyamin. And finally, as Rabbi Poston said, we have the enigma of Mashiach ben Yosef, that before there is Mashiach ben David, there is a fellow that's called Mashiach ben Yosef. We don't know a lot about him. He gets killed in a war. He gets killed in the wars of Gog and Magog. And he might not even be announced, so to speak. But he represents a force that will be involved in the killing or destruction of Amalek. Maybe he was a private in World War II who fought the Nazis. We really don't know exactly. So what do you see from this? You see from all of this the idea in the Gemara in Bava Basra that Amalek is defeated by the children of Rachel, not the children of Leah. And therefore this was the raison d'etre of Shaul's Malchus. So we have three different reasons why there is a Malchus of Shaul. Reason number one, since their motives for seeking a king were sinful, God gave them a Malchus that inevitably would fail. Reason number two, in the aftermath of Pilegesh Begiva, it was necessary, the concubine in Geba, the Chelik of Binyamin, it was necessary to welcome Binyamin. And reason number three, Amalek must be destroyed by the children of Rachel. Now, to take the Gemara in a bit more detail, why is it so essential that Amalek be defeated by Rachel's children rather than Leah's children? So again, here too, the Meforshim give us different reasons why this is so. One reason is that Amalek, of course, is the grandson of Esav. Right? Esav had a son Eliphaz. Eliphaz had a bunch of regular wives, but Timnah was his concubine, wasn't even his wife. And from the relationship of Eliphaz and his concubine Timnah came the Amalek that is the source of such hatred against Am Yisrael. So therefore Amalek is the grandson of Esav. And when Yaakov meets Esav, all of his children bow down to Esav with obsequiousness, with submission, except for Yosef, who was protecting his mother, and except for Binyamin, who wasn't born yet. So the concept is, all of the tribes become subordinate to Esav, Amalek, because they bow down, except for the Bnei Rachel. Because there is a concept that when you submit yourself to Rishayim, spiritually they will have power over you. One does not submit to Rishayim. According to that, really, it's not really a question of Rachel versus Leah, it's simply a question of which ones bowed down to Esav, which ones did not. Others look at it in a different way. They say that Amalek represents sinas chinam, hatred for no reason, bitter, destructive hatred. All the brothers that sold Yosef are guilty of sinat chinam, except for Yosef, that is the victim, and Binyamin again was not involved. Binyamin was too young, and in any event would not have been involved in this mechira. So the concept is, what makes us vulnerable to Amalek is sinas chinam, and it's only the Bnei Rachel that are immune from that sinas chinam. Right? So these are different concepts of why Shaul was given the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. And when he messed it up, you don't find that David HaMelech was told. In fact, what's interesting is, it's a little hard to understand, because you would think that Agag was the last Amalekite alive, and Shmuel killed Agag. Now, there was a woman who was carrying a baby that was Amalek, but there seems to be nobody else. We seem to assume Haman is descended from that one guy. And yet you read in David HaMelech's own lifetime that there were Ger Amalekim, there were converts from Amalek hanging around. In fact, in the beginning of Shmuel, Beis, it is a Ger Amaleki who takes credit for killing Shaul in war. Remember, there's some ambiguity. The pasuk seems to say Shaul committed suicide, and yet in the beginning of Shmuel Beis, there is an Amalekite convert who takes credit. It's hard to understand, but it seems there were a number of Amalekites around, and they were somehow allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael, or at least nobody did anything about it, because when Shaul did not complete the mitzvah, we were not able to do it. The mitzvah was a mitzvah that can only be done, or only be completely done by Bnei Rachel, not Bnei Leah. Okay. So that's one set of questions. Why is there a Malchus Shaul? And why is Mechias Amalek connected to the children of Rachel rather than the children of Leah? And that is the pattern that you see all the way starting in the Midbar, going to Shaul Amalek's time, going to Mordechai Esther, and going all the way to Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, there's another aspect to the problem, which has nothing to do with Amalek per se, but it's very, very worthwhile to ponder. And that is, be it as it may, Shaul does most of the job, but Shaul fails to kill Agag, the king of Amalek, and Shaul also fails to destroy the sheep, because his intention was the sheep, as spoils of war, would be brought as a korban for God. And Shmuel discovers this, and Shmuel basically prayed for him. Shmuel, you see it, by the way, how much Shmuel loved Shaul. It's very, very interesting. Because when he talks to Shaul, he is as tough as nails. Shaul begs forgiveness. Shmuel refuses to walk with him, refuses to look at him, refuses to acknowledge any type of exoneration. And yet, right before that pasuk, it says, Shmuel cried to God the entire night, begging God for mercy. One has to understand this, that Shmuel begged and pleaded that God should give Shaul a second chance. But when God said no, Shmuel gives no indication that he cares about Shaul at all. And when Shaul, in a last-ditch act of desperation, grabs onto Shmuel's coat, as Shmuel walks away and the coat rips, Shmuel says, as this coat has ripped, so Hashem has ripped away the kingdom of Israel from you and has given it to somebody who is a better man than you. Very, very harsh. Very, very harsh. But you have to know that this is an example of Shmuel, who is such a faithful servant of God that in spite of his own personal pain at this, once Hashem gives the order, Shmuel carries it out with no emotion moving in the other direction. But the question that the Mefarshim raise is, why is Hashem so much harsher on Shaul when he makes a mistake than he is on David HaMelech, right? David sinned with Bathsheba. David took a woman who seems to have been married. We'll discuss what Chazal say about this. He seems to have committed adultery with her. Perhaps even rape. We're not really sure if it was totally consensual, at least initially. He eventually married her. And it is true that David suffered tremendously. He lost a child, and David and Avshalom, all of those rebellions were in the aftermath of David and Bathsheba. But the one thing that didn't happen is David HaMelech did not lose his kingdom. And in fact, Shlomo HaMelech himself is the next son that David had from that very woman, Bathsheba. So the question is, Shaul is living under a world of one strike and you're out. And David commits sins which in some ways even greater. David's sin is a sin of commission on two levels. It is a combination of adultery and possible murder, or at least indirect murder, because David sent Uriah Hittite to the front, knowing there was a very good chance that he would be killed. So David's sins are sins of commission, And Shaul's sin was a sin of omission, and yet David is given another chance, albeit with punishments, and Shaul is not given another chance. Now, one answer I already gave you, that is, by right, there shouldn't have been a Malchus of Binyamin at all, but it was given to him to do the mitzvah of Amalek, meaning to say, that's the only reason there was a Malchus. So if he's only given the job for one reason only, if that reason is not fulfilled, then what do we need him for? I mean, that would be one answer there. But the Mefarshim give other answers to this question. And let me give you two terutzim that Rav Yosef Albo gives. Rav Yosef Albo is the author of Sefer HaIkarim. It's a fundamental book in Jewish philosophy. I don't want to go over the whole book, but just to acquaint you with the thesis of the book. The thesis of the book takes issue with the Rambam's idea that there are 13 principles of faith that a Jew must believe in, and a failure to believe in any one of these 13 principles is grounds for heresy. And Rav Albo argued that the Rambam was confusing or combining what might be called root principles with what might be considered branches. There are Ikarim, and there are Anafim. And Rav Albo argues, there are only three fundamental principles in Judaism. And the three fundamental principles are the existence of God. Number two, reward and punishment, that God on some level is going to reward virtue and punish evil. And principle number three is the revelation of the Torah. Now, just to illustrate a difference between Rav Albo and the Rambam, let's say a person believes that God rewards mitzvahs in one way or the other, but the person doesn't believe in a personal Mashiach, or a person does not believe in physical resurrection of the dead. According to Maimonides, that person is a heretic and an apikoros. According to Rav Albo, the person might very well be mistaken, because actually Rav Albo didn't disagree with the Rambam. Rav Albo also believed in a personal Mashiach and resurrection of the dead. But he simply said, those are branches of a fundamental principle called reward and punishment. And the particulars of reward and punishment are not fundamental. So Rav Albo basically said that if somebody denies a personal Mashiach, perhaps they are mistaken and foolish, but being mistaken and foolish is not the same as heretical. Same thing Rav Albo argued, if one took the position that God may have some type of material form. The Rambam says that material form. The Rambam says that it is a fundamental principle that God cannot have a body. Rav Albo says, again, he agrees with the Rambam, but he simply says that in terms of fundamental principle, God could be whatever he wanted to be. If God wanted to have a body, then why couldn't he have a body? In fact, then you get into the philosophical conundrum. Okay, this is you can chase the tail all night about this. In other words, if God is omnipotent, all powerful, then how could one talk about God not being something? How could God not? No, God can't have a body? Well, what if God wants to have a body? You're telling me he can't? So the philosophical answer is, yeah, there is one limitation on God. He cannot be not God. But, that's a tricky one. Now, there's the old question, can God commit suicide? Well, So anything that is a contradiction to a definition of God is even beyond the divine. But that's not a limitation. That's simply a definition. But okay, as I say, these are the discussions that only philosophers love. I don't want to pursue it that much because I only brought this in just so you understand that Rav Albo is essentially disagreeing with the Rambam regarding the principle of what is fundamental and what is secondary. Now it's interesting that although in modern society, modern Jewish society, everybody's always saying, in the Haredi world at least, that the 13 principles of faith are fundamental, and if you don't believe any one of the 13 principles, you are an apikoros, which would seem to indicate that Rav Albo's thesis is not accepted that much. The Sefer Ikarim is a very, very popular work even today. People do learn it, and part of it is because he has a very easy style, and it's a much easier work to learn than the Rambam. So it's a fascinating thing that if a work is written in a very nice and clear way, people will gravitate towards it, even if it states ideas that are against the mainstream of what the standard Torah world believes. Okay, putting that aside, one of the nice features of Rav Albo is he goes into many, many interpretive digressions of biblical stories, having very little to do with his overall thesis. And here in particular, Rav Albo offers two interesting answers to this question. Why is Hashem so tough on Shaul and so forgiving on David? And he gives the two answers. Answer number one, Shaul's sin, although it was a sin of omission, pertained to the duties of his office. As a king, he was given a responsibility to do something. He failed to carry out his responsibility. That is grounds for removal. David HaMelech's sin was a personal moral failing. It was not an abuse of the power of the office. Now, l'chaira, it's not so clear to me because it all depends. Certainly, assigning Uriah to going to the front, that seems to be, he did that as king. But apparently, Rav Albo understands that the main avera was not the killing of Uriah. The main avera was being with Bathsheba, and that was simply a personal commission of adultery. That was not a matter of his power as king. And therefore, Rav Albo differentiates between violations of your duties as a ruler and personal sins. Violations of your duty as a ruler, you get no second chance, you are removed. Personal averos can be covered by tshuva. Again, those of you that might remember American politics, if you this is very, very analogous to the issue of, should mention in show, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. It was a very, very similar type of issue, in which here you have somebody who was doing improper things, allegedly doing improper things, but it was not an improper political decision of the office. And indeed, in the United States, there are constitutional scholars that say a president can only be impeached for misfeasance in the conduct of his office, not for personal sin. Which means to say, if a president goes to a bar Saturday night and beats somebody up with a baseball bat, some people have argued that is not an impeachable offense. He can go to jail for it. He can go to jail, but he cannot be removed as president. It's only if he did something in a political decision-making capacity. So this is actually what Rav Albo says. This is teretz number one. Then he gives teretz number two, which also has relevance to Clinton in a different way. He says, the difference between David and Shaul was not in the magnitude of their sin. Maybe David's sin was worse in some ways, but it was how they responded when the Navi calls them on it. And this is very, very significant. Shmuel comes to Shaul after the Amalek thing was supposed to be completed. And Shaul comes out to Shmuel and says, Baruch Hashem, I have fulfilled the commandments of Hashem. And Shmuel says, what is the bleating of the sheep that I hear? And Shaul says, oh, the people made me do it. If you analyze, he first denies it. I've done everything. So his first response to Shmuel is denial. And his second response to Shmuel is blaming other people for his decision. I was afraid of the Am, of the nation, and I listened to their voice. Now, by the time David sins with Bathsheba, and of course we know that what Chazal say that first of all, as a technical matter, David was technically covered. Every soldier who went out to war in David's army gave his wife a get, so he shouldn't be missing in action. So she was technically divorced, yep. And Uriah had a right, David had a right to send Uriah to the front because Uriah refused to obey an order, but of course, what was the order? I mean, listen to this. It's an interesting thing that the Gemara gives David this prerogative. Because what happened was, he discovers Bathsheba's pregnant because she missed her period. So he wants to cover it up. He wants to cover it up by being able to claim, this is before DNA testing, that Uriah is the father. He orders Uriah to take a furlough and come home for a marital visit, in the hope that, he'll be with his wife, and then David could pass off the pregnancy as Uriah's child. And Uriah says, no, I'm a loyal soldier, I want to go back to the front. So the Gemara says, Uriah defied a royal order, and David had the right to kill him. So, here's what people get. People get the Gemara wrong. So people say, when we talk about David Amalek's sin, people say, oh, how can you say David Amalek sinned? The Gemara says, beferish, anybody that says David Amalek sinned is a mistake, is a big mistake. Uriah was chayav misa because of a married b'malchus. And Bathsheba was divorced, no problem. Well, let me just put it this way. It may be that technically there was no sin, but David certainly thought he sinned. And Nathan the Navi certainly thought that he sinned. So when Chazal say anyone that said David sinned is making a mistake, that means anyone that said that David literally committed adultery is making a mistake. But spiritually, this was an awful sin. This was an awful sin. A sin for which David did tshuva the rest of his life. A sin in which David lost children, was driven from Yerushalayim. So one should not minimize this sin. And what happened? Nathan the Navi goes to David and says, there was a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man had flocks of sheep, and the poor man had only one little lamb that was his little pet. And the rich man took that lamb and slaughtered it for a party when he had so many lambs, so many sheep that he could have taken. What do you think of such a man, your majesty? And David Amalek says, such a man deserves to die. And the Navi points to him and says, you are that man. What is recorded in the book of Shmuel is David only said 2 words. Chatasi Lashem. I have sinned. And here's the thing. David could have given the very same excuses that Chazal say he had. Here was a man, if he wanted to be lawyer-like, he could have given those excuses. And he didn't. So says Rav Yosef Alba, the difference between Shaul and David is not in the nature of their sin, but in their taking responsibility when they realize they did something wrong. A leader can make mistakes. And the fact that a leader makes mistakes is not necessarily a disqualification. The Torah believes in tshuva for political leadership, just as it believes in tshuva for individual sins. But tshuva requires honesty. Tshuva requires responsibility. Tshuva requires not blaming others or making excuses. And certainly leadership requires that you not say you're afraid of the people. You know, Saul used to say, there's a famous Mishnah that says, in the footsteps of Mashiach, Ikvas into Mashiach, the generation of the face of the generation will be like the face of a dog. Pnei hador ki pnei hakelef. So what's the expression, will be like a dog? So Yisrael Slanter said, Pnei is leadership. The face of a generation are its leaders. So what is a dog? A dog is always walking in front of the master, but the dog is looking back to see where the master goes. So that means leaders who are supposed to be leading will in fact be looking at where people want to go. And they will lead by going where people want to go. Right? That's how politics works, you know. If 51%, again, I think more about Americans on this issue, 51% like abortion, you will be a pro, all of a sudden you'll be a pro-choice person. If 51% are against abortion, you will be a pro-life person. People change their philosophies all the time based on what will get them more votes, and certainly in Israel on a number of issues. This happens as well. And this is what Shaul is saying, I was afraid of the people. How can a leader be afraid of the people? A leader is supposed to guide and lead. Right? So these are the two mahalchim that Rav Yosef Albo gives, why Hashem was so harsh with Shaul. One is the political misfeasance versus personal moral failure. The second is denial and excuses versus taking responsibility. And the third, which is really a subdivision of that, is being afraid of the people. In other words, because I'm afraid, I can't lead them because I'm afraid of what they will do to me, I'm afraid they won't accept my decision, and the like. Okay, so these are some perspectives on the story of Shaul and Amalek, and again, the two things to keep in mind is why Mechias Amalek is only Zerah Rachel, not Zerah Leah, and then the second question is why Hashem is so harsh with Shaul, unforgiving with Shaul, and is forgiving with David. There is another Mahalach, the Meshech Chochmah gives. Meshech Chochmah actually says that, it's interesting, that Shaul's Aveira was something that the whole nation of Israel knew. The whole nation of Israel knew the king of Amalek was spared. So there is not just an Aveira of not doing the will of God, there is what is called Chilul Hashem. By contrast, so you wouldn't know this, because we read in Tanakh the whole story of David and Bathsheba, but at the time, this was a totally private thing. Nobody knew that the king was with Bathsheba, and therefore the Meshech Chochmah says, sometimes the Chilul Hashem of an Aveira is much worse than the Aveira itself. And with Shaul, there was Chilul Hashem, and with David, there was not Chilul Hashem. Okay. Now, we have a very, very important idea about Mechias Amalek, right? According to most of the Meforshim, the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek applies even today. That's the physical eradication of Amalek. And the reading of Parshat Zohar, which is the mitzvah to remember, these are two different mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of Zechira, to remember the evil of Amalek, and there's a mitzvah of Mechia, actual destruction. Now, Mechia, the Meforshim say, since we can't really identify who is an Amalek, so we don't do that today. Although the Rambam says, if in theory you had such an identification, you'd be obligated to kill him. But Zechiras Amalek we do have today, and that's the mitzvah of Parshat Zohar. And that's the only Kriyas HaTorah of the year that, according to many opinions, is a Chiyuv D'Oraisa. Normally, Kriyas HaTorah is only Midrabanan. But in the Sifrei Chasidus, there's a very, very powerful idea that the Amalek that is outside of me has power over me only if there's something in me that's also an Amalek. And therefore, the mitzvah of eradicating and destroying Amalek is first and foremost the Amalek of my heart. Mocho emcha, destroy the Amalek within. And when you destroy the Amalek within, you will not be vulnerable to the Amalek without. What is the Amalek within that we're bound to destroy? So the truth of the matter is, you see from the Torah itself, there are two Achilles' heels that make us vulnerable to Amalek. The first place Amalek attacked us in the desert was Rephidim. It's an oasis. But Chazal say Rephidim is also an acronym or an abbreviation. Rafu Yideyem Min HaTorah. That's an idiom that means their hands were weak. They were grasping the Torah very loosely. And this is an idiom. When you care about something very deeply, you hold on to it tight. If you don't care about it so much, you hold on to it loose. Amalek represents kind of an indifference, a complacency, a lack of passion or excitement in Avodas Hashem. And when you're just going through the motions, that is already the root of Amalek. Seen in this way, Amalek is not visualized as this evil demonic force. Amalek is this bored intellectual that basically says, well, this idea is as good as that idea. We live in a world of moral relativism. We live in a world in which there are no real values. And we live in a world in which everything is a matter of opinion. And thus, in a college classroom, it is not even that uncommon for someone to make the argument that the Germans, from the German perspective, even the Holocaust made a lot of sense because of communism and whatever other crazy type of construct you can have. So, there's no question that if this is what Amalek represents, cynicism, relativism, it leads to complacency and a lack of passion. Because if every idea is as good as any other idea, if everything is valid, then nothing is valid, then why care? Why commit? Why feel strongly? Now, maybe I'll remain a religious Jew simply because it's convenient to me. That's called orthopraxy. Some people just say, I'll live in a religious community because I'm comfortable with it. But what is there to believe? So the first Achilles heel of Amalek is Rephidim, Rafu Yideyem Min HaTorah. Rav Tzadok makes the same point in a different part of the pasuk. The pasuk says, Asher korcha baderech, which literally means Amalek encountered you in the way. But Rashi says that korcha comes from the word kar. They made you, no, but Rashi says they made you cold. And he gives the example that Amalek was like, when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, the whole world was afraid of them because of the Makos, because of Kriyas Yamsuf. They were like a boiling hot bath. Amalek was that first nation that jumped into the hot bath. They got burnt, but they made it a little cooler for the next one. That's how Rashi says it. Rav Tzadok takes the same etymology of coldness, but he says it another way. Amalek attacks you when you are cold inside. You are cold in your service of God. You go through the motions. You do the mitzvahs. without feeling, without passion, without excitement, without geschmack, with indifference or a sense of burden even. And that is the koach of Amalek. And as Rabbi Poston said, it's also true that karcha is also connected to keri, which means happenstance, coincidence. But it all leads together, because Amalek views the world as just happenstance and coincidence. God is not involved. You see, that's why you have to be careful. Amalek does not represent, let's say, something like Islam. Islam is, we believe the Arabs are B'nai Yishmael, not Amalek. Because Islam, does have at its core some religious idea that gets distorted, but there's some religious idea there. Amalek is that which relegates God as an irrelevancy. Now, in many ways, Nazi Germany, and I'm not making the claim that the Germans or the Nazis were actually descended from Amalek. There are different arguments about that, but that's not necessarily so. But in terms of a philosophy that may have been the closest to the pure evil of Amalek, might be Nazi Germany. Now you might say, well, no, but Nazi Germany was Christian. Not really. Nazi Germany was not Christian. Nazism used God as a symbol to do certain things. But essentially, Hitler himself wrote in Mein Kampf, and it's very scary, it's very frightening, and I feel uncomfortable even saying this, what a perceptive observer of Judaism Hitler in his psychotic way was. Hitler knew things about Judaism, deep ideas about Judaism, that many Jews don't recognize. He writes that one of the reasons he hates Judaism, hates Jews, is because they brought conscience and morality into the world. And he said, those are limitations on human power. Because what does morality say to a person? Morality says, even if you're able to do something, to get somebody's land, get somebody's property, you don't do it because it's not right. Hitler said, that's not acceptable. If you can do it, you do it. You do what's best for you, for your power. But what did he recognize? He hated it, it's true. But he recognized that without God, there is no morality. Without God, it's only a matter of power. He hated the religions that brought monotheism, ethical monotheism, into the world. So Amalek is not a philosophy of God, even utilized in a negative way. It is a philosophy that there is no God, or God is irrelevant. Life is about power, and there is no absolute set of moral values that should limit a human being. And what happens in the world is mikra, and therefore Rav Tzadok says that gives you a coldness of heart. So when a Jew has a coldness of heart, Amalek comes in. That is Achilles heel number one. Achilles heel number two is sinas chinam, when there's hatred among the Jews. That's why I mentioned before that Amalek can only be defeated by Zerah Rachel, not Zerah Leah, and one of the reasons is because of the sinas chinam of Zerah Leah and Mechiras Yosef.
Baseless hatred.
Yeah, what did I say?
Well,
Groundless. Yeah,
baseless
groundless hatred. Sinas chinam.
Yeah.
Sinas chinam. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it turns out like this. And now let's go to Purim. This is the one brief ending with Purim. Purim, one of the things Purim celebrates is the downfall of Amalek, because Haman is Amalek. So, when we celebrate the downfall of Amalek, it's not enough that we celebrate the destruction of the external Amalek. We have to take steps in our life to eradicate the internal Amalek. And in Purim, we do exactly that. With respect to the internal Amalek of baseless hatred, That is why so many of the mitzvahs of Purim are connected with creating love and friendship between Jews, such as mishloach manot, you send food to people, that's to create friendship. Charity to the poor, that is about connecting to others, caring about others. Because what's going on? We defeat Amalek, but how can I defeat Amalek? If I have sinas chinam, I'm vulnerable to Amalek. So the day that celebrates the defeat of Amalek is a day that must celebrate Avas Yisrael. Now, the other Achilles heel, which is actually the first one that I mentioned, coldness and indifference in the service of God. How Purim deals with that is a little less obvious. But one of the things you need to know, and I'm sure you know this, is that Purim is considered to be a re-acceptance of God's Torah. According to Chazal, when we accepted the Torah in Har Sinai, Hashem held the mountain over our heads and forced us into it. Okay, that needs more explanation than I can give right now, but we'll talk about it next week. So we accepted the Torah out of fear, duress, and compulsion. On Purim, out of gratitude, we re-accepted the Torah out of love that we had previously accepted out of fear. That's the meaning of the phrase, kiyamu v'kiblu. They accepted what they had previously undertaken. Now, if you think about it, what is the difference between accepting a commitment because you were forced into it and accepting a commitment because you are lovingly taking it on? That will be the measure of enthusiasm you bring to the job. When you accept something because you were forced to do it, you will do as little as you need to get away from the threat. If you discover that you're not going to drop dead if you do X instead of 2X, you're only going to do X. But if you do something out of love, you will do whatever you can to bring pleasure to the one that you love. So, B'kitzur, number one, Purim celebrates the destruction of Amalek. Number two, in order to destroy Amalek on the outside, we have to destroy Amalek on the inside. Number three, there are two negative Amaleks on our insides, which makes us vulnerable. One is indifference and coldness in Torah and mitzvahs, and the other is sinas chinam. Therefore, Purim, we address both of these issues. The coldness and indifference is rectified by re-accepting the Torah with love and joy, and not just fear and duress. And the sinas chinam is addressed by mishloach manos and matanos le'avyonim. So again, Purim is indeed a celebration of the downfall of Amalek, but that celebration must involve looking at the Amalek within us. Because the concept is, that which is outside of me can only hurt me if there's something of that is within me. So B'ezras Hashem, as we approach Purim, may it once again be a day of redemption, a day of Geula, a day in which all the powers of Amalek within and without should become destroyed and nullified, paving the pathway towards the Geula Shlema.
Amen.
Sure.